Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in. So we have today the webinar is going to be about the introduction to the Global Biodiversity Standard for ecological restoration, and it can be applied to other projects as well. So just a little bit about the ERA and about this webinar, and then I'll hand it over to Paul to go over the Global Biodiversity Standard. Right. So the Ecological Restoration Alliance, the main agenda for us is to try and create a repository of knowledge around restoration, and have these conversations on different methods, tools, and other resources that might help in people in starting their own projects, or might be able, and facilitating connections between people so that we can actually be a little more ecologically sensitive about the kind of work that we do. So in this webinar, we have Paul Blanchflower. He's the director of Auroville Botanical Gardens. He'll be talking about the Global Biodiversity Standard for ecological restoration. So this is a standard that has been developed over a period, across by multiple organizations, and Paul will be able to walk us through a little bit more on what it means, how does it work, and how it can all come together in the space in India. So I will just hand it over to Paul right now, and I will give more time to him, then try and explain more about what he does. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thank you. Do you want me to just change the screen, or you can do that?
Yeah, you can just click share and it'll go to your screen.
Perfect. Okay, super. There's a few more people in the waiting room, Arjun. No? You can probably see them.
I'll just do that.
Yeah.
So as we go along, people, please do put in your questions in the chat box, and we'll field them towards the end of the call.
Sure, Arjun. And if you want to, Arjun, if you want to interrupt me for something, then you just interrupt me, and I can stop and answer a question or something.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to be here talking to you about the Global Biodiversity Standard. This is a project that's being coordinated by Botanical Garden Conservation International, which is an organization that's based in the UK. It's been running now for about 12 months. And so we've done 1 year. So this is a bit of an introduction to the Global Biodiversity Standard. And then what I'm going to do is tell you about how, where we've got to in the process, and how then we can work as the Ecological Alliance here in India together on this project. So I'll just start with a sort of a gentle introduction to moving through this slide, which is, there we go. So, got it. Sorry, not so easy. Okay. So the state of the planet is, as everyone probably aware, there's definitely a crisis with respect to the trees and the plants and nature. And this is some work that was put together by BGCI. They've done a global tree assessment where they've been trying to look at all the trees around the world. And these trees have been looked at by various experts in the botanical garden community. This is one of the strengths of BGCI. It connects botanical gardens literally from Brazil to America to England to Finland to Germany to all the way across to China and right the way down to Australia and across to India. And so there's an extraordinary repository of information which they can draw on and get people to contribute to. So they've actually managed to do the global assessment of trees, and these are some of the numbers that came out, and these have been published, and they've, like a while back, you would have seen this on the BBC News. It was picked up by all the major news organizations. So there's a pretty good understanding now of where we are with the trees and around the planet. And so that obviously then brings us to this point where people are trying to do something about it. We all are. We're all out here. Everyone who's listening to this seminar will probably be ready to plant trees to do something. But there's a lot of projects that are being pushed around that actually are accelerating this crisis. And the image on the right-hand side just shows you a classic sort of picture where you've got the green of the plantation, which is right up against the last remnant of a particular tree in Chile, the Nothofagus. And so a lot of programs that are out there that are claiming to be planting trees, to be sequestering carbon, to be doing agroforestry, even restoration projects of the type that we're involved with at the Botanical Gardens, which is mine restoration, can all be actually accelerating the extinction of species and increasing CO2 emissions. So what this global biodiversity standard tries to address is how can we have a standard that can be applied to many different types of projects that looks at basically, is the project good for biodiversity or not? That's the simple bottom line. And so that's why it's being developed, and that's why it's being sort of pushed out. So as I'd mentioned, the Botanical Gardens has a huge network across the world. There's many people in India who are part of this network as well. And so they've done a number of projects over the time, and they've built this sort of base. So we have 650 members. The Global Trees Campaign, which is sort of working with the Franklin Foundation to try and work with threatened tree species. So they've identified a number of trees that are very rare. We have a project running at the Botanical Gardens with Tropaetus potteri in the south of India. And there's tree projects that are all over the world that are being run through the Global Trees Campaign and coordinated. There's also an Ecological Restoration Alliance within the Botanical Garden community, which stretches across from America through India, all the way up to Thailand, I think even into the Philippines. So you've got an Ecological Restoration Alliance that's working there. And there's Global Tree Assessment, which is some of the data that I put up on the previous screen. So they've done this Global Tree Assessment. So there's a good body of knowledge, and there's a good collection of people who are interested and knowledgeable about global ecosystems. And so it felt to Botanical Garden Conservation International that if a project like this to assess biodiversity was built around that knowledge, then it could truly be a global network and a global standard that could be rolled out and adopted by many different organizations, funding agencies, governments, and things like that. So that's where the aim is to get to. So let's just look again. I mean, so I'm going through an introduction here reasonably quickly, but so we're basically trying to address these challenges of tree planting, which are doing damage to ecosystems. I mean, even when I was talking to someone in the UK, they were talking about eucalyptus, which I'd never heard of being planted in the UK. They're planting monocultural eucalyptus trees in the Welsh mountains, which is crazy in England, but we have the same problems in India and around the tropics, where people are just planting simple monocultural plantations, calling them carbon sinks, getting paid for them, being funded by large organizations, and that global carbon market is causing a lot of damage around the world. And so the Global Biodiversity Standard tries to address that and looks at how we can look at habitat restoration, agroforestry, that are basically looking at, are we using native species? Are those native species being planted in a way that's consistent with ecosystems, reference ecosystems? And how are those plantations actually starting to restore biodiversity? And so, as I've mentioned, it sort of takes this expertise of the Botanical Gardens community and utilizes that, and then tries to build this network around the world. So the standard is there to, these are the four main thrusts of it. Is really to protect and restore biodiversity. We'll talk as we go through this seminar about how it's really important to protect what's already on the land, and not to have projects that cut down native forests and basically plant something else and say we're doing something in terms of restoration. So protection and the restoration of the actual existing biodiversity is one of the key elements to this project, and is one of the criteria that we assess. The use of the local and international experts, this is really talking about trying to get things on the ground. So what happens with the biodiversity standard is that we have hubs that we're establishing around the world at the moment. I'll talk about that again a bit later on, but we have hubs in Brazil, Peru, 3 in the African subcontinent, which is in Madagascar, Uganda, and Kenya. And we have the one at the moment in India, which is based in the Auroville Botanical Gardens. And there's plans now to open up hubs in Malaysia, Thailand, right across the tropics. And then each one of these hubs is trying to set up satellite hubs within these continents so that there's more and more local knowledge. So again, as India is a great example, we have a huge diversity of vegetation, and no one person can really understand the native plants from all of the areas. And so how do we create this network, this understanding that can then be there to help this biodiversity standard really be objective and independent, which is the third point. And how can it really assess the vegetation on a very simple level and be independent and be, you know, accessible to everyone and equitable, which brings us to the fourth point. Accessibility is really about cost. A lot of these carbon projects to actually be assessed for the carbon project costs a lot of money. So again, how do we bring that down to a relatively cheap standard that can be accessible for many projects from any walk of life, and also take into account, and when they talk about equability, we're talking about how do we make sure that it's not just a large corporation that's planting trees, but there's actually a whole social aspect to the project as well. So this is really the challenge that's there to take on any tree at any cost on that minimal level, and talk about how can we actually do long-term best practices that bring out these positive outcomes for these key things, which is biodiversity and local communities, and almost as a side effect, carbon capture. So the real emphasis is on biodiversities and local communities. But anyway, by planting trees and by doing restoration projects, we're actually capturing carbon. And if we're doing it with a sensitivity to the ecosystems involved, we're going to be capturing much more carbon over the long term. Yep. So when we focus on biodiversity, we've really got to start to create recognition. So the standard can do that by focusing on biodiversity, by being a globally recognized standard that already a number of funding agencies are involved in creating. Again, we'll come to that as we go through, but Plan VIVO, Ecosia is this search engine that promises to plant trees for every time you use their search engine. These are organizations that are actually on the ground as we're developing this global biodiversity standard. And so by recognizing projects that have this positive impact on biodiversity, we're bringing in the level of people's awareness higher. We're bringing it to governments. We're bringing it to some of these global groups, like for example, the standard will be launched at the COP22 meeting, which is happening in November. And so creating that recognition that biodiversity is important, and then publicly recognizing best practice. So it's how to bring that up so that people see that there's a reason to work towards best practice. It's not only to do with doing the best you can, but actually there's an incentive. And we're looking at, like I've mentioned, funding agencies that are actually going to adopt this standard for their work. And so it'll mean that if you're prepared to follow these best practices, you'll have a much higher chance of receiving funding from these organizations, such as Plan VIVO, Ecosia, and these things. And this assurance, so it comes on from the other side. It's like talking to governments, talking to these financiers of the large-scale planting projects, and saying, look, by creating this global biodiversity standard, can actually make sure we have a rapid assessment methodology. We have a very clear set of parameters that we're measuring for the global biodiversity standard. How can we assure you as a funder who's providing assistance to other projects to plant, how can we assure you that your work is actually doing good for the planet rather than, again, moving down that negative scale? And the knowledge is there. We have extraordinary knowledge. And the networking in the world is rapidly moving forward, but at the same time, it's amazing how it's still quite it's not a very fine resolution of knowledge that we have on the ground. And I think with the Indian ERA, this is one of the exciting things that's happening with the ERA. And if we can align the work of what the Global Biodiversity Standard is looking to bring with the work of the ERA, we can really help both of those practices move forward in a very interesting and productive manner. So how does the Global Biodiversity Standard work? On the left hand, on one side of the screen, you'll see these 10 golden rules for reforestation. So this is a paper that was written in 2000, August 2000, and it's been authored by a number of different people from around the world. Towards the end, you'll see Paul Smith and Kirsty Shaw at the bottom. Both of these people are working for BGCI. Kingsley Dixon is very much associated with the Society for Ecological Restoration. So these are a number of different names from around the world that came together and wrote this paper. So we're looking at something like nearly 3 years ago. And it's a great paper. If anyone hasn't read it, it's really worth reading, because it sort of tries to set it out on a level where they're looking at these three things: the carbon, the biodiversity, and the livelihood. So really trying to bring nature back into that focus, but that somehow has that underlying sense of human society. And so based on those golden rules, which we'll come to again throughout this seminar, is how does it work? So we're looking at different types of land management. So it's very important to grasp that at the beginning, that we're not just looking at ecological restoration or habitat restoration as it's written here. We're also looking at tree planting, forestry programs. We're looking at agroforestry initiatives or agricultural initiatives, because a lot of these large funding agencies are funding agroforestry in different parts of the world. And so how do we start to bring the Global Biodiversity Standard, which will then encourage people that are doing tree planting, if they're doing it for a commercial purpose, how do they give it that edge where it's helping biodiversity? How do we ensure that they're not planting dangerous invasives or really sort of like quite dry biodiverse deficient species? And how do we encourage them to put in biodiversity elements within their projects? So it's not about just saying we should sort of not do anything, but it's how to, in all of these programs, how do we encourage biodiversity to be used? And so if we can create that element to the standard, that it takes awareness of these initiatives, that then they will be eligible for certification. It'll hopefully push people to think about it. And yeah, we've got organizations that are able to apply, individuals, organizations, and as the certificate is rolled out, we're looking at a tiered system. So again, there's definitely an aspect of progress. So it's looking at how, if someone's running a project at the moment, how that project can improve. And already say it's looking at biodiversity, but by being involved with the standard, we're hoping that people will actually get more and more interested in. The process is there's an extensive online application form which gathers as much data as possible, and then there's a key remote sensing assessment, which is very much looking at what the site was like as far back in time as possible, to see what was the land use before, and if there's if we're walking into a project that's new, then obviously we can see what there was there. But if we can see in an existing project how it's evolved over the last 20 years, that's also very important. And some of the sites are going to be quite large, so remote access can really give us an overview of what's happening over the entire site. And of course, we've got site-based survey by the local hubs and international experts. So this is one of the things that we've been working on over the last year, is to develop these survey techniques and to review them and see how they fit within the standard. So these are the 8 criteria. These criteria have been drawn from the paper that I mentioned just before. And I'll go through them one by one so that we get an idea of it. And we'll come back later on as we look at how we're scoring the system. So protection of existing habitats and biodiversity. This is kind of key and crucial. It means that everybody who's taking on a project really needs to be aware of what habitats, what biodiversity is there on the land. I mean, I'm a great believer and always say that there is no piece of land that doesn't have any biodiversity value. There's always some biodiversity value, whether it's a few grasses or whether it's insects, or there's always some biodiversity value. But how do we take what's existing on the land and ensure that we're not removing those habitats, but we're actually increasing their scope, and taking awareness of the fact that some animals actually quite like bad lands, and how to ensure that when we're taking on projects, for example, we have one project where the Indian horned owl, the great Indian horned owl, is there. And as we're moving through the project, we see that it's very important to keep open areas, to keep areas where they can hunt rather than just trying to plant trees. So really, that's when we come in a little later, but it's really about creating mosaics, but working from the existing habitats. And that brings us across to this, carry out these appropriate inventions without displacing the natural biodiversity. So we have the habitats and we have the animals that are already utilizing the sites, and how do we build from that? So we look at what's already there and ensure that, yeah, if there's some sort of an agroforestry system or forestry system, it would certainly not then clean out the native scrub and plant trees on a fresh sort of piece of land. It's really, how do you integrate what's existing within a project? And then who are the local communities and the stakeholders? Now, this is a significant part of the Global Biodiversity Standard, is to ensure that local communities are not displaced, and that they have a stake, that they are actually stakeholders. Of course, there's other stakeholders aside from the local communities, but it's very important that the projects have that degree of consultation, and that it's not an imposition on the local communities, and that the social fabric is not actually being disturbed or destroyed by projects that are coming in. The aim, of course, is to maximize biodiversity through the restoration. And that's really looking at efficient techniques to ensure that we're not just, again, planting plants that are not needed to be planted, to understand what is your biodiversity that you're aiming towards. Reference ecosystems are very important in ecological restoration, as most people will be aware. And so it's looking at that. Where are we trying to get to, and what sort of ecosystems are there, and how do we maximize that biodiversity through the restoration efforts? And of course, it says refrain from planting invasive species. A lot of sites probably will have invasive species on them, particularly from our experience. That's the type of land that we're working on. So, you know, but I think an understanding of these alien species is very, very important for everyone who's engaging in projects like this. And so hence, it's important for the assessors, for the people actually implementing the standard, to understand the potential invasiveness of a number of species, whether they're, even if they're sort of exotic, i.e. from outside of India, or even if they're translocated from within India, sometimes there can also be effects that they have. The next aspect is using native species and also trying to incorporate these threatened species in the plantings wherever possible. So to recognize that there are a list of species that are rare, threatened, and endangered, and to somehow integrate those into the possible plantings. It's good for everybody. It's good for the species. It's good for publicity. If you're working with rare and threatened species, humans have this wonderful attraction towards the rare, whether it's a diamond or whether it's a tree that's just on the verge of extinction. And so how do we get those species into the plantings and incorporate those and help to conserve those species that are quite threatened? The genetically diverse material is important in nurseries. We're going into a period of environmental uncertainty. The climate change is definitely going to affect the way environments are there and how they change. So we're looking at a genetically diverse, and it's not just one tree, or it's really something that's quite substantial and is taken from many habitats. And the last point about the monitoring and evaluation is super important, because without that, we're not going to learn. And we're not looking, you know, any project that is looking at longevity will definitely have to have monitoring and evaluation and this sort of adaptive management system working. So these are some of the partners that are there within the Global Biodiversity Standard. We have Etihad was there in the beginning. They're now not part of it. They were there. They gave some seed money. The project is now supported by the British government through the Darwin Initiative, and that's the funding that comes to Botanical Garden Conservation International. But you'll see there's a number of other partners that are already signed up. So Traffic is a very interesting group that's working with they cause wildlife trade, but they're also looking at sustainable livelihoods. It's not just wildlife, it's also plants. Plan VIVO is they're a funding organization that create plantation projects for communities for the benefit of communities. So they find communities and they set up programs where the carbon credits are sold, but the funding comes directly back. They claim that 60% of their income from the carbon funds come directly to the communities. Ecosia is the website, and then you've got the IUCN and some of the big names up there. And also the Society of Ecological Restoration, which will come for now and talk a bit more about that in the latter part of the talk. And then these are the hubs. So this is what's actually happening on the ground. We have what we call technical partners, which be BGCI, Society for Ecological Restoration, Plan VIVO, these characters. And then there's these hubs that are spread across the world. So we have Peru, Brazil, Uganda, Kenya, Madagascar, and India, as I've mentioned before. And so we've had we interact quite regularly on Zoom meetings. And we've had one meeting this year in Kenya where we all got together and started to really look at how the challenges that each different hub was having in surveys. And so we're sort of sharing and learning from each other. Some hubs have much more knowledge about remote sensing. Other ones have interesting approaches to monitoring of biodiversity. So things like that. So we're sharing a lot and developing together. And then just this, I put this up at this point because it's interesting to see that this is way back. This is probably a year and a half ago, but already people are recognizing it as a standard that's required. And there's probably a number of little standards that are all coming up together and they're all developing. And it'll be interesting to see which one actually does settle down and become the standard that's there. But I think the one that is coming out of the Botanical Gardens certainly has the credibility of expertise behind it and a very wide sort of community that it's actually involved in implementing it. Because even if botanical gardens are not hubs, they can actually provide resource people for looking at the different vegetation types that would be considered. So now where are we at the moment? So the standard will be rolled out in November at the COP20 meeting, and online the forms are there. So for people to apply for the standard, we've got them online and we're testing them through the local hubs. So if anyone's interested to get involved in this, it would be great to have people contact us, and then we can go through this process of filling in the online forms together, and even looking at setting up a survey to assess the biodiversity of the project. And at this point, we have the funding that allows us to do these certifications for free. And then, of course, the information that we collect during this process, once the standard's been rolled out, will actually allow the people who've been through the testing process to gain the standard as one of the early adopters. One of the critical things about the certification, which has come out through this testing process, is that the certification will be based on improvement of biodiversity, not an as absolute level of biodiversity. And so we're looking at how do we assess the current biodiversity and the biodiversity at the project's inception. What's the movement? It's very important to recognize that everything is on a continuum, and that this continuum, as long as the continuum is moving forward, that we're actually looking at an improvement of biodiversity on multiple levels, then you'll get a good assessment for the biodiversity. And of course, negative scores, if there's certain areas within the project that is actually damaging biodiversity, you'll get negative scores, which will then balance it out. We're starting to use, we're standardizing the assessment, which is a process, and we're trying to follow international frameworks, which will come up in a minute. And of course, if you have different land uses within one project site, then the scores are averaged and based proportionally on the different areas. So if you have an area of forestry and an area of habitat restoration, each one of those will be taken on a proportional basis. This is how the 8 criteria now, we're scoring out of 10 points. So we've got these, it's just a sort of a quick reminder of what I was talking about before, is protecting the existing habitats and biodiversity. Select the appropriate areas and don't destroy biodiversity in other areas. Get involved with the consultation and partnerships with the local people. Aim to maximize, you know, you're really trying to get as much biodiversity in through ecosystem restoration. And it's not just planting, it's natural generation or assisted natural regeneration. What are the techniques that can be used in this standard or in your projects to assist this restoration? The aspect of the invasive species, using of native species and incorporating the rare species, and then back to this thing of genetic diversity and robust monitoring. So I just go through a few of the criteria because it'll just give you a feeling for what's there. You know, like this is criteria 1, the level of protection. So if your project doesn't have an area of natural habitat, then simply this criteria is not looked at, and it doesn't affect your overall score. So you can see there's a sort of a continuum. So if you're in a strict nature reserve, or if you're in a protected landscape, you're getting high points. And if you're in primary or secondary conservation, the number of points you're getting towards the global biodiversity standard are less. And as you then sort of go into more and more degraded areas, and this is very much talking about natural habitat. So if you've got natural habitat that's being pushed towards any of these statuses, then you're going to be losing points in terms of your biodiversity. But it's really, again, it's like to emphasize here, it's about this continuum. Where are you when you started the project, and where's the project taking you? These are the critical points. When we're talking about stakeholder engagement, we're looking at a number of questions, and we're looking at, as larger projects move forward, we're looking at more and more stakeholder engagement. And on the right-hand side, I've just put up the one of the wheels that comes from the Society of Ecological Restoration. And these are very interesting tools. I'm not going to go through this one, but if you're looking at it now, you just sort of look at the different aspects that are being taken note of with respect to the stakeholders. No, it's like the knowledge, the natural capital, economies, the actual communities that are involved, their engagement, and the benefits. So this is an interesting wheel, and basically you work out if you're just starting to do that, you're getting 1 star, and if you move out and you fill up the whole thing, you're getting 5 stars. So it's a graded scale, which we'll come back to in just a minute when we look at the restoration wheel. So this is how we're looking at stakeholder engagement, and then your management. So this is criteria 8. These are baseline studies. So the really key issue at this point are the baseline studies, because the baseline studies of any project are so important that we can then really see how the continuum is being done. If we can't have baseline studies, that's where we come to remote sensing. That's where we come to trying to understand where the project started, which would also be a part of the initial surveys. And again, we've got something like 37 possible actions that can be being carried out for management or for monitoring. And so you can score a maximum of 5 points. So it's not that you have to be doing everything. It's just to really be seeing that certain aspects of these criteria are being looked at. And if you're managing to do 20 of the 37, you're actually going to get way more than you actually need, because you only can get a maximum of 5 points, which comes to just 10 actions. So it's 10 actions out of the 37. Once they're being carried out, then you're well on your way to receiving the standard. And of course, just to do all of this work, then we're looking at how do we do the site checks. This comes back to the rapid biodiversity surveys. This is what we're doing in Auroville as one of the hubs. And we're looking at, again, different types. So it just looks at the different land use type: protected area, restoration, agroforestry, plantation, and agricultural areas. So all of those are being included in this standard. So it really looks at how can we, bring biodiversity to agriculture. How do we bring it to agroforestry? And this is just a simple, if we got over 1,000 hectares, we're looking at 5 locations. If we're looking at a 50-hectare site, we're looking at 2 locations. So it's how do we bring this rapid biodiversity surveys into play? And so this is what like I say, this is what we've been doing. So we've developed a rapid assessment survey that looks at the species. So we're basically looking if they're present, rare, occasional, common, if they're locally abundant. And again, are they native species or non-native species? Are they exotics? We're looking at the regeneration occurrence, because I think that's a critical indicator of where an ecosystem's moving. So do you have common regeneration across the site? And again, if that's an exotic species, there's abundant regeneration across the site, it looks like we have a problem. In a sense, it's all common sense, but it's how do you send a team in that really looks for these aspects. So whilst we're doing our species surveys, or while we're walking through the site, we're identifying species, and we're giving this very simple species occurrence, regeneration occurrence, and we're also looking at soils and water as we do the survey. That just gives us this overall impression of what the site is looking like. So just going to take a moment here to introduce you to the Society for Ecological Restoration, which some of you may not know. I was not super aware of it until perhaps 6-8 months ago, and I've become aware of it through working on this project. It's an organization that's based in America. It's been going for about 30 years, and it's spreading out across the world. So there's this Society for Ecological Restoration, and there's some great people involved in it, and they have a very systematic approach, and they've produced this document in 2019, which is the International Principles and Standards for Ecological Restoration. And so the assessment for a number of the criteria within the Global Biodiversity Standard is going to be based on their restoration wheel. And it's also based on this restoration continuum. So it's an understanding that we've got a movement. So as we start to be involved with ecosystems, be involved with the world that's out there, we're starting in a degraded state, perhaps, where we have a lot of impacts on the land we're looking at, whether we've got pollution coming in, whether we've got pollution from water, pollution from the air, whether we've got grazing pressures, whether we've got extractive practices happening in terms of firewood and fuel wood. Some of the land that we work on totally degraded areas that literally have prosopis growing on them, the Madras thorn, and there's not much else growing on the land. So you can start from there, and then you're moving on this continuum. And this continuum is it can take a long time when we're talking about ecosystem repair, but we're looking at these 5 processes where we reduce the impact, we start to remediate the problems, then we start to rehabilitate, and then we actually get moving into ecological restoration. And so this is a kind of an understanding that's being built into the Global Biodiversity Standard, and this is coming from the work that's been done by the Society for Ecological Restoration. And this is their restoration wheel. And so this restoration wheel is I found a very good way to start to look at a site. It makes you look at all the different aspects of the site. And so whilst and by looking at these different aspects of the site, we'll be able to measure the different criterias. And so the starting point of the wheel is down there on the right, on the left-hand side, with absence of threats. So overutilization, invasive species, contamination, some of these I've just mentioned. And then as you go past that, you're looking at what's happening to your substrates. Are your soils, are they eroding still? Is there still inflow of chemicals? Is your chemical balances within the soils, are they deteriorating or not? And so each time you look at one of these things, you give it a rating 1 to 5. So you give your rating of 1 to 5 along here, and you're starting from what was the baseline on the project, and is it moving in a positive direction? So is it moving out from 1 to 5? So are the soils becoming more stable? Is erosion reducing? How's the water balance on the soil? And then as we get round to the species composition, we're looking at, are the desirable plants? Is it, like your invasive species may be still there, but maybe there's many more desirable plants that have now been introduced to the site or existing on the site. Same with the animals, no desirable animals. The birds are coming back, the butterflies are coming back. And then slowly you come to this thing of no undesirable species. So if you've still got exotics, you would maybe score low on that, but that's something that can improve over time. And so once we've looked at the actual species, we start to look at the ecosystems, whether the strata of the ecosystems are present. Do we have ground covers? Do we have lianas? Do we have shrubs? Do we have trees? Do we have emergents that are coming out of the forest? Do we have epiphytes? All again, dependent on the actual reference ecosystem that we're trying to work towards. And again, trophic levels, is everything happening at all those trophic levels? And the spatial mosaic is also interesting in the sense that, do you have grasslands mixed with forests? Do you have, a spatial mosaic of different ecosystem types within the project site? Or is it really starting to become a monocultural, even if it's just in a sense, it's sort of like with only one habitat type? Do we have edges to the forest? Do we have the forest itself? All of those things, is that structural diversity there? Same with ecosystem functioning. Are those the recycling, the habitat, the interactions, the resilient, the recruitment? So we're looking again at what sort of recruitment's happening into the ecosystem in terms of regeneration. And then, like this is the last one, is these wonderful external links as the landscape flows, or the gene links. Are the genes coming in from outside? Is the pollinators moving between different habitats? And are there actually these kind of links between the habitats? So this is a really interesting way to look at a project, and that is forming the basis of, as we move through the criteria, what we're looking at in terms of this wheel. And so this just gives you a simple example of how a wheel might look with different things. Here you're looking at contamination, so it's getting a 5-star rating. So there's 0 contamination on the site. There's minimal invasive species, but there's still some invasive species. And the overutilization, it means that there's no, like maybe firewood extraction has been brought down to a sustainable level. And so to the other 7 these other 5 criteria which form part of the 8 criteria, they're using these attributes to be measured. So number 2 looks at all of them. Number 4 looks at just the sub-values of H round to O. And so it just gives you this way of, it gives you a system that you can follow to be able to assess a site and to see what's happening in that site, and is it a global biodiversity? Is it good for biodiversity, or is it actually degenerating? So it always comes back down to that, but we're giving it a sort of a structure that's there. And so at the end, you sort of come to this idea that everything is about change on the continuum, what's moving. So if you're moving in any one of those directions, you're getting plus points. And if you're actually falling backwards, you're getting minus points. And so by following the wheel and by looking at each one of those aspects of the ecosystem, you're starting to see, is it a plus, minus, and it starts to give you this idea of how you can assess the global biodiversity standard and look at the project in a sense from that perspective, which allows then this standard to have, it'll have 3 tiers. So which level is your project running within the global biodiversity standard? And as I cut, this is the final slide. I'm trying to stick to the 40 minutes that I agreed with Arjun. So the next steps, how can we use the resources and energy of the global biodiversity standard to help us in our work in India? This is one of the questions that's really there. The global biodiversity standard is there. There's a network that's spreading out. There's international groups that are there to help facilitate the global biodiversity standard, but the whole thing needs people on the ground. So how can it be a synergy between the two? What's happening with the Ecological Restoration Alliance and what's happening with the global biodiversity standard? And the next question is within India, how do we start to develop satellite hubs in India? A big part of the next 2 years is training and certifying people to be able to carry out the assessments for the Global Biodiversity Standard. So initially that would be happening through our hub, but then hopefully as time goes by, other groups will set up hubs and be able to carry out this assessments. And of course, the whole point, which maybe I haven't actually mentioned all the way through, is that eventually this becomes a viable economic business model that actually brings an income into organizations. So, for example, by carrying out a certification for the Global Biodiversity Standard, it brings an income stream into one's project, which will be very useful. It means taking the knowledge that we all have and taking it out there and actually starting to create an economic model that can then sustain some of the work that we're all doing. And one of the two baseline informations that are really important for something like the Global Biodiversity Standard is one is the vegetation maps. So what type of ecosystem are we expecting in different geographical regions? And germination protocols, because it really wants to be that sort of accessible tools for many people that are starting to engage in ecological restoration or any kind of project. And so germination protocols is again something that BGCI is coordinating across the global community. And for example, from our work in Auroville, we've already created 200 germination protocols for the different species of the trees of the tropical dry green forest and the dry deciduous forests. And so again, with the Ecological Restoration Alliance in India, how can we pull that together into sort of a standardized open source format, and who's interested to get involved in those sort of aspects of the work? And so I think at that point, I've been talking nonstop for 42 minutes, according to my stopwatch, which is running by the side of me. So maybe Arjun, we can stop there and see just what needs to be said by some people. Are you there? You're still there?
Yeah, of course. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for this. Yeah. We are still there, and we were all there throughout the talk. I was monitoring this thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you so much for sharing all of this. And I'm sure there are I think there is a lot of possibilities in which there can be collaborations and where people can get involved. But I think it'll be nice to start with. I think somebody's just posted that I would like to be a certifier of SBG Hire Me. So I'm guessing there is already a lot of interest. Well, we can start with some of the questions that have already come up on chat, and then we can take that forward from there. Does that work, Paul?
Yeah, sure. I was just looking at chat now. Are you aware of some of the questions that came up?
Yeah. So I think towards the end, you were talking about funding and how the standard can help towards, how the standard can help provide funding. I think Avneet had a question here, which was, one of the challenge for restoration is to assess the area that had undergone plantation for a long time, but there is a funding problem and how to overcome that. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about the funding aspect. Not just for the people who are certifying, but how does it work for the projects as well?
Okay, so there's two aspects. I'm just looking at the question. One of the challenges for restoration is to assess the area that had undergone plantation for a long time. So that means in the past. So at the moment we have some funding to go out and do assessments of land. That funding slowly dries up as the project goes on, because one of the things is to try and turn it into somewhat of a commercial project. But that's there at the moment. So if people are interested to have their land or their projects assessed, that's definitely a possibility. And that will be there for the next year at least. I think in terms of funding in the long term, or in terms of projects, there are a number of funding agencies out there that we've now met, for example, like Ecosia, Plan VIVO, Reforest Action. They're often, at the moment, they're still interested in large projects over 400 hectares. But I think as the global biodiversity standard evolves, I think there's a strong recognition that in certain ecosystem types, there's a real importance to secure, particularly, like, for example, the tropical dry evergreen forest. We have, I believe we have less than 0.01% of the tropical dry evergreen forest left in pristine condition. And so I think there's a growing awareness even amongst the funders through this project. And they're becoming much more aware of the importance of biodiversity and the preservation of it. To give an example, Ecosia was only really interested in funding large-scale tree plantation projects with a reasonably minimal amount of money for per tree. But in the last year and a half, they've come together with BGCI and are now funding plantation programs for rare and threatened trees, and the actual cost per seedling, or the funds per seedling, is dramatically increased, because there's now a recognition that it's really important and to be able to conserve and plant a rare and threatened species, and to ensure that it's there is a really important aspect. So from the biodiversity funding point of view, these are the two avenues that are there at the moment. Does that answer the question, Arjun, in your sense?
I think I'll feel that to Avneet. Avneet, does that help clarify your question, or is there anything else you'd want to add in out here? Okay, I think I got an okay. Yes, got it. Okay, great. So the next question was from Vivek, which was on the 8 criteria, the slide that you had on the 8 criteria.
Yeah.
How are these different from the 10 golden rules? Are there different stages of life cycle or different use in some way?
I think in a sense, the 8 criteria is really a distillation of the 10 golden rules. So it's not really different stages of the life cycle. I think it's on a practical level. You've got these 10 golden rules that were developed for that paper, but as this standard has evolved and been developed, it's somehow saying, okay, well, actually, these are the 8 criteria that are really important to assess for a restoration program. And so let's whittle it down to these 8 and get it really clear. And you could, throughout time, each one of those criteria is becoming more and more precise. What's really important, I think what's happened in the last few months, since January, when we had the large meeting, is really this understanding that we're looking at the continuum. We're not just going in and saying, is that project good for biodiversity? How strong is it in biodiversity? Oh, it's got lots. It's really about where the journey is going. And so it's evolving. And so I think in answer to that question, I would simply say that you've got the 10 golden rules, and they've been distilled down to these 8 criteria. And now these 8 criteria are being looked at in terms of a continuum, and a movement from one stage to the next. And as has been said in a number of meetings I've attended, to move from 1 star to 2 stars or 2 stars to 3 stars is actually a significant movement. It's not like, you've got 1 star or 2 stars. So in terms of the scoring, we're looking at, like a movement from 2 to 4 is enormous. And a lot of restoration projects or something like that will never reach the final restored ecosystem, or not in our lifetimes. No, so I think it's not that we're trying to get 5 stars on everything. We're just looking at projects that are actually working towards a significant contribution to the conservation of biodiversity.
So, Paul, just following up on that, and that's part of Shrishti's question, as well as Krishna has also asked something similar on those lines. When we talk about biodiversity, so Shrishti's question is, when we talk about biodiversity for projects, do we focus on both flora and fauna, or is it just just flora protection okay? And Krishna, follows up with this: how do we measure the biodiversity in the first place? And I think, is it a Shannon or a Simpson index or something else? So more of the specifics on that.
Okay, so I can tackle the first one with a good little story. Is we were looking at Do we focus on flora or fauna? I think the standard has come out of the botanical garden conservation, the botanical garden community from flora. And I think the theory was that if we have the flora, then the fauna will follow. And biodiversity, if you have a significantly, if you have an ecosystem type, your reference ecosystem that you're working towards, and if you've got the elements of that flora within your project, if you've got some habitat that you're protecting with the flora, then you're on the way to something pretty cool. But we did a project down in Kutralam. We went for an assessment down in Kutralam, beautiful piece of land with streams flowing through it. It was a mix of agroforestry and natural habitat. But we started, we've over the last 3 or 4 surveys, we've started to bring faunal people in to just assess, the butterflies and the birds. And they walked out and they said, like there was 10 species when we expected to find 40. And it was very interesting because at that point, then we could go back to the project. It was actually a piece of land that an owner, and say your biodiversity is not strong, and it was clearly based on this idea that they're using pesticides that's basically knocking out your fauna. And so yes, it's now very important to have some faunal aspect to the work, and that's again something that's being woven in a little bit as we move forward. I think for India, what we're interested in doing is looking for indicator species. Actually, the group in Uganda is using frogs, amphibians, as an indicator of biodiversity health. For us, we're looking at using butterflies and trying to come up with a list of indicator species for butterflies. No, so you can have a continuum of the common species or the more sensitive species. So in answer to that question, I think it really is about, it's about the flora because that's where our expertise is, but the fauna is definitely a very, very important indicator. And so we're trying to engage with that. In terms of what methodology are we following, we're not following a strict ecological system. Like I put that slide up. Maybe I go back to it if the slides are still up. We're really working on this sort of rapid assessment, so that in 1 or 2 sessions, you can walk through the land and you can see which species. So we're following this system of present, rare, occasional, common, locally abundant. And it gives you a relatively good idea. And what you can do once you've done a rapid assessment survey like this, you can come up with a statistic of how many of the species are common and how many are occasional and how many are present or rare. We did it for a reserve forest in the south. And you get a very simple statistic that says of the 47 species, only 6 are common. And of those 6 common species, 2 are actually planted exotics. So you can get a snapshot. If you go into more of these other systems where you're really starting to look at like these ecological assessments, then your time on the site increases and your costs go up. So it's how do we keep the costs of doing the standard at a low rate, but still get a good snapshot of what's on the land. And so this is why these rapid assessment surveys, these techniques are so interesting to be involved in, and to
they are going to be in spring, but in summer, maybe they will be wiped out. So if you are saying we are doing this rapid assessment survey,
yeah.
I assume that we will miss the other seasonal, let's say, I don't know, emergence.
I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. We just went up to Bhuj and did a site assessment in the Rann of Kutch. In a very large area. It was 50,000 acres of an old sort of king's forest that's still there, the Rakal. And we went in March when it was super dry, you know, and a lot of the trees didn't even have leaves. So we were sort of doing forensic botany to identify the species. We had no idea of what are the grasses on the land or any of the seasonal herbs or the ephemerals. And that's definitely an issue. But at the same time, you're not trying to capture an entire species list. You're trying to capture whether the project is moving in a direction. And so you're looking for clues. And so if you're looking at a project like that, yes, it would be ideal to go after the monsoon. We actually went in at the beginning of the really beginning of the hot season. But it was amazing just by working with the trees and shrubs as indicator species, finding that, you know, you had this Acacia Senegal, which was, you know, very common, finding that you had these sort of patches which were relatively intact as a sort of a coherent scrubland. Whether that's the actual initial reference ecosystem is totally up for debate. But you still get this snapshot of what the site is, because you can see which of the bare areas, where the exotics are, what's regenerating. And so it's like that. We're not doing an entire ecological survey of the site to come up with a complete list. We're looking for indications of how the biodiversity is being conserved. And I think if you've got a good management, once you've inspired people to look at biodiversity, then hopefully they would, you know, be doing more surveys as the project unfolds.
I think just as a follow-up to that, there is, if you're doing a, I think Divya had mentioned that if you're doing a survey, it may help to identify the indicator species and the best time to do it, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's, again, it's like where the knowledge of the local ecosystem comes in. I think if you've got practitioners that, you know, who are experts in that field, then they would know when's the best time and what to look for as indicator species. Like when we went up to Bhuj, we weren't very aware of the forest, and so we took two friends from the Ecological Restoration Alliance across with us, and so they became the local botanical experts. And so I think that's this sort of super strength of something like this that draws from the botanical gardens community, but also in our situation where we can draw from practitioners around India who have this wonderful knowledge about local ecosystems, and we can build a system that that everyone's sort of working and helping each other to understand the strength of these different projects.
So just to be conscious of time, we are already beyond 5 o'clock. Paul, I want to check in with you if you have some more time to answer some of the.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
good. I'm good for time. I'm just
Okay,
going to
that's
drink
great.
some water, but.
So I have a little confession to make. The internet went at my end, and I lost all the questions from my side. But I do remember reading a question from Samuel towards the end, if he's still online, which was more in line about with the current conversation of how do we measure biodiversity. So, Samuel, if you're still online, maybe you could ask your question directly.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Samuel.
Hi. I was just, my question was about the fact that I'm a bit unclear about the idea that when you're certifying a project,
yeah,
you're probably measuring it against a standard for that local ecosystem.
correct.
And so my question is, how will the GBS account for the nuances of each kind of ecotype or ecosystem when a certifier goes there and kind of, you know, gives it a, you know, this is almost there, or this is, you know, it's not nearly there, that kind of a situation. I mean, that's my, I don't know if I am clear with that, but that's
let me try and answer what I understand, and then you can always tell me if I'm totally off the ball. But I think it comes back to this thing of the continuum. So it's like, for example, I see your, you know, like you have different, you're talking about the Yarra valleys where you have almost pure monocultural natural areas of dog trees. So in that situation, if you know your reference ecosystems and you know the project that and you're there on the ground looking at a project, and you're also aware of where the project started. And so it's like there's this idea of this continuum. Are you on track towards where the reference ecosystem is that you're heading towards, no? And so I think that's the yardstick. Has it moved? Is it moving in the right direction? Where was it in the beginning? Where is it now? And from the indicators that you see and assess on the ground, is it moving in the right direction?
Right. But my question is,
Yeah.
So the certifier will have to have the knowledge, a deep connection with the reference ecosystem, and know what the reference ecosystem for that place is like, or will it be something that the global biodiversity standard will develop for each kind of ecosystem type? I mean, there's this kind of.
I think at the beginning and now probably for the next, I don't know, many years, it's definitely dependent on local knowledge.
Okay.
I mean, as artificial intelligence increasing, things like that. I mean, when we went up, I don't know, but I think right now we're really looking at, local expertise. And again, that's, for me, is always the strength of this, is that there's local experts, whether it's botanical garden communities or whether it's restoration practitioners.
Right. So we really need everybody to stand up for this to really.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's like as it moves along, I think it's if it does take off, then I think it's a really interesting thing, and then it sort of puts everyone's knowledge to a practical use if people are interested to do that. I think that for me is quite exciting. No?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
So thanks, Paul. Another question was from Avneet again, which was around, during these surveys, what soil parameters should be measured?
That's a question we're looking at right now.
Yeah.
And I think it's about presence or absence of humus. It's about, do we see different soil horizons? And again, it comes down to local expertise. No, if you're working in the dry desert areas, you'll have a completely different expectation for soil structure than if you're working in a forest, say for example the tropical dry evergreen forest, where we expect a sort of maybe 5 centimeters of thick humus that's totally aggregated with roots, and then after that you often find a totally different soil. So I think it's that we're not really looking at measuring on a chemical level. We're just looking at it on a kind of an ecological level, where it's a basic understanding of how the system would naturally be looking at. And I think that's where we are with the standard at the moment.
Thanks, Paul. There's another question from Hopeland. Is there a consolidation of seed banks and nurseries in India? And I think this ties in a lot to the questions that you asked towards the end. Curious to know from practitioners if local genotypes are kept in focus while setting up such seed banks and nurseries. If someone is setting up one, is there a go-to protocol database that has been established and that is publicly accessible?
You're breaking up a bit for me.
Oh, sorry.
I found the question. Is there a consult? Yeah. I found the question from Hopeland. Yeah. I think with respect to this, BGCI has a very nice data form for seed germination protocols, cuttings and propagation, which is what we're looking at standardizing all of our protocols to. Just to say that like BGCI, like the database is publicly accessible. They have on their website, but I think the ERA in India, I mean, this is what would hopefully be coming out of the ERA, is that we set up our own, which is basically synced to what's probably happening on a global level. I think definitely know that local genotypes definitely really important when setting up nurseries. But I'm not sure, or if there is like the question is really, is there a go-to protocol database that has been established? I can't answer that question. Maybe someone else can.
Divya, could you unmute yourself and ask the question directly since my voice is getting cut?
Hi, Arjun. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Yeah, finally get to hear the whole thing about the BGCI standards. What I was asking is, you were saying that you're trying to establish the best protocols for different species. Wanted to know if these protocols are established based on well-designed, strict experimental studies, or is it, like there are so many of us having nurseries and we've grown different plants. So, just say what, it may not be a study, but then it's knowledge which has been developed through practice. Is it something that one could share?
Absolutely. 100%. I think that's the, I think it's really important because there's so many different ways of doing it, and I think knowledge from people that have done it is the most important.
Yeah.
Particularly if you've done it many times. No, this is the thing. It's like we've run a nursery now for I don't know how many years, 20 years, and so there's a buildup of knowledge. No, it's like even if you do a strict germination protocol, it's 1 year and it's like that. No, so I think there's such a value in sort of people's knowledge from.
Yeah, that's exactly why I asked, because some of us who've been doing this work, we are not bound by time, right? We know that these are long-term commitments, and therefore we are not in a rush to grow these plants. And so, like, at least in our nursery, we do not do scarification or whatever acid treatment and all that. We just plant the seeds and wait. And if they're not predated on, most of them germinate.
Right.
So do you think then that's good enough?
That's fantastic. I think that's totally good enough. I mean, there's two things that I can, just anecdotes that I can say is, one, we had a species called Carnanthus zeylanica, which we scarified and we did all the different things on, and nothing happened. And then we'd left it in a bed and forgotten about it for a year, and it germinated after a year, and that's it. They just basically take 1 year to germinate.
Yeah.
So that's one of them, and the other one is this is Terminale paniculata. We can collect bagfuls of seed down in our area, even in the Javali Hills, and nothing germinates. Whereas we met someone from further north, and they said, "Oh, you just throw it on the ground and it germinates in 3 days or something."
Yeah.
So it's like
3
that,
days, okay.
Yeah. I mean, but it's like that. So again, it's like whether this, in certain areas the seeds don't set, and in certain areas the seeds do set, and they're fertile or not. And so I think that's also massively important information, which may not come out of a germination test because it's just that's too precise. It's like, really, we need that sort of ecological information from people around the whole area, because if it's easy somewhere, it's obvious that the seeds are in much better condition, I think.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I have just a follow-up comment question. Said is that the certification standards is based on improvement.
Yes.
And very often, once we've identified certain areas, in some of the areas that we worked in, our efforts are to keep what is there and make sure that it doesn't slide downwards, backwards, or whatever, right? And very often it is also quite difficult to assess incremental changes. It is something that you will see only after 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, whether it is through restoration or sometimes even with just protection. Yeah. So, that's one thing we've been finding hard to grapple with many of these certification things, including carbon. Carbon is also based on additionality. And for biodiversity, we've been wondering how it, we feel that it is actually good to show that something is stable and not sliding backwards. And it's probably more difficult to show something like, say, a population of a species is increasing naturally just through protection or restoration. I'm just wondering if it is really one needs to relook at in the certification process and not always look for increases or changes. Sometimes even stable populations are good enough.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's a nuance that it's one of the questions I've had in the last 2 meetings. Is really it's like if particularly if you're looking at, say, for a forestry system or something like that, and you've got 2 different neighbors, and one's just growing on monoculture and one's growing you've got a lot of difference between those 2 things. And so this idea of movement, and if someone's looking after a plot that, like you say, is being sustained and is not degrading, I think that's it's also really important to be able to see that. And so I think, like there are negative scores for degrading ecosystems, but yeah, I think that nuance of something that's being sustained is a really important aspect that we have to weave in somehow.
Yeah, because one of the certifications, the Rainforest Alliance certification, for example, it certifies plantations. It really does not matter whether those plantations have some forest fragments in them or if they're completely converted to tea or coffee. And whereas from an ecological perspective, I think plantations which have set-asides of fragments or, just the forest should actually fare better, should get 100%. A better scoring. Yeah. So it would be great if, even this standard could have those nuances as you mentioned. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, that was a very long conversation. Sorry, people.
Paul, I have a follow-up just based on the current slide. So I am interested in being the sort of get trained by, I don't know, BGCI, and then, I don't know, help in this assessment, or let's say certification. So first, I want to know, is it an ongoing process or is it going to be happening in future? Part 2 of the question is, nowadays, that many of the local stock stakeholder, they are practicing this superstar forestation. We call them MIA methods. So I would like to sort of ask, what are the thoughts in the lens of GBS? So should we sort of certify them, and what do you think about them? So I think it's is it clear, or should I?
Could you let me answer the first one first, and then go back to the second one, because you broke up a little and I didn't quite get the whole question.
Sure.
So the first one first is we are in a process of training people. So the idea is that the hub in Auroville will train people in India. So we're going through a training process, or we're developing our own capacity for training, and then we'll be offering courses for people to train as certifiers of the GBS, and some of that will start to happen this year.
Okay. So is there eligibility criteria, or?
I think that's something we're going to look at, but I think it won't. It'll just be someone who has basic knowledge of ecosystems or some basic background. But I don't think it's too stringent. I think people that have some knowledge or and again, we can. I think this is what we're going to be looking at and trialing out is what kind of people. How long does it take to get someone up to we're basically looking at and again, is it a residential course for a number of weeks, or is it 1 or 2 weeks and then online stuff? It's like, if people already have skills with GPS, it's a bit of a mosaic that we're going to have to be adaptive to as we're doing it, no? And so that's something that we're looking at now. At the moment, we're looking at the GPS is a very useful tool for us, particularly when you're doing your surveys. So how do you bring that in, And the curriculum and know how it will work.
So
does that answer the first point?
Yes, I think in one line I need to keep checking the Auroville website. Is that good?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, hopefully we can announce it on
maybe
we
with
can announce it on the ERA and things like that. No, I mean that would be the ideal of way of doing it, and just set up a sort of a group of people that are interested.
Okay, that will be fantastic. The second part was about the Miyawaki technique of deforestation.
Miyawaki. Okay.
Yes, most of the NGOs, they are doing it, and most of the CSR fund is going there. So I was thinking, like, man, if the GBS is going to sort of work in this way, is it possible to sort of certify them, or what are the thoughts?
I think
about...
I mean Miyawaki is a fantastic thing to start talking about because everyone has a very different opinion of it. I have quite strong opinions. So forgive me for my strength of opinion. But I think the way Miyawaki was developed in Japan was basically as a technique for reforestating highly degraded mining areas.
Mhm.
And if you look at the original set of parameters, it's all about native species. It's about a mix of trees, shrubs,
Yes.
and native plants. So if you're performing a Miyawaki plantation,
Okay.
in as per the original ideas of Miyawaki, it's a great idea if you need to do it. If you need to do it, if your site is that degraded and in that condition, then it's a technique that you can follow. But what's happened in what I see in India is that people are planting, you know, basically trees very, very close together, non-native trees. So at that level, if you wanted to certify something like that, you would be certifying it
In the negative thing.
in a reasonably negative way, because you're not looking at a reference ecosystem, and you're not really using native species, and you're not creating the different trophic levels. So you're not really working towards biodiversity. You may go from an industrial wasteland in the middle of a town or a brownfield site, and you're turning it into a forest, and that will have certain, you know, certain species have, you know, contributions to biodiversity. So that there is something there, but you know, to put it in context with a reference ecosystem, I think you're not looking at that. And hopefully in the end we can change the way Miyawaki is done in India, and that people do suddenly wake up and say, okay, actually it's about native species, and it's about using shrubs, and it's about using you know, mixing that all together so that the system is there. But it should be efficient, no? Anyway, we could probably have a whole long discussion about Miyawaki.
Yeah, thank you.
Until 10 o'clock or something.
Sure, it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Krishna. Thanks, Paul. There are just 2-3 more questions. If that's okay, Paul, I'll just ask them. Yeah. Masweta, I think you had a question which might not have been answered. Could you unmute yourself and ask directly? My connection is still bad, so I'd rather this happens this way.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paul, for the very good presentation. I have been to Auroville and I'm impressed by the work. It's a beautiful place. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you completely.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned while giving your presentation that you assess the damaging parameters. So I'm like very curious to know what are the damaging parameters you look into, because it's a kind of a semi-arid area, if I'm not I'm not sure, but it kind of seems like that. Also the water table, you know, I have seen a lot of bamboo trees there. So how you maintain the water quality and how the groundwater table helps you in such kind of restorative work? Am I clear?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
So I think in Auroville, Auroville is a very diverse area with many different things that have happened over time. It wasn't a coherent restoration project that started and everybody knew what they were doing. So I think there's a lot of experimentation. And again, not necessarily by people that had a lot of experience. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm, but I'm not sure that there was huge amounts of knowledge. So I think when we're talking about Auroville, you know, you're seeing many different things. Bamboo, I wouldn't know if it affects the water table in a negative or positive way.
No, I'm not talking about the negative aspect. I mean to say that the groundwater table, how does it, I'm looking into the damaging parameters, assessment of damaging parameters for such kind of restorative projects. Because if we consider some other states, they do have very poor soil quality. So what do you look here, the damaging parameters?
I'm not quite getting the damaging parameters in the sense of what's actually
What may impact the restorative work? What do you really look into it?
Negatively.
Yeah, negatively, yes.
I think one is like the obvious one is pollution that's coming into the site. If there's any pollution coming into site, if there's soil erosion, if that's not being arrested, if soil conservation measures have not been taken, then you're sort of degrading your ecosystem still. So if you go back to the ecological restorative wheel, you'll find that you'll still have negative things on there. And again, the same with the invasive species or the non-natives. So I think if you go back to that wheel and look at those parameters, then you'll see that there's certain parameters that have a negative effect or will bring down your project if you're trying to do restoration. So it's basically soil, water, and non-native species are probably the three damaging parameters that I would immediately recognize. And pollution or something like that is a more obvious one, but it's an externality in that sense. Is that talking to your point?
Yeah, sure. It's just that right now you're not focusing more on the soil quality. It is just plantation more and more of tree cover, is it?
It's not necessarily tree cover. I think that's a really important point to make, particularly within the Ecological Restoration Alliance. If your reference ecosystem is a grassland, then you should be working towards a grassland. If your reference, it's not just about planting trees. And I think, again, in my understanding of biodiversity, I think it's really important to try and work towards mosaics. So you have a variety of habitats within one, if possible, within one system. Because again, if you have edge effects, if you have forest, if you have, so in terms of any project at the moment, that's what you're looking for. If you have a site that's homogeneous in terms of soil, you can, in terms of your planning, you can create variety within the ecosystem. If you have a system where your soil types are different, or if you have outcropping rock, or if you have shallow soils, thick soils, you're automatically going to get that diversity. So that, again, that's what I would be looking at in those terms.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mahasweta and Paul.
Yeah.
There's another question by Snehalata. Snehalata, would you be able to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly, please? If you are still, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
So I just wanted to ask, like, when you are trying to assess at a site level, and when you're trying to go about saying that these many species can be planted over here based on all your criteria, how do you decide on how many species to plant, first of all, and how do you go about planting them? In what series would you plant them? Because I would presume that some species would come up better under shade conditions, some species would come up in a pioneer open environment. So how do you go about that, and how many species would you choose? And other thing I wanted to ask, so if you can answer this, I'll ask you the other one. Yeah, thank you.
I think, again, it's always I'm sort of, it's back to your reference ecosystem. And again, in your ideal world, you would have your reference ecosystem and you would have all the species at your disposal, and you would be able to assess where your site is on the continuum. And you would be able to say, okay, these are species that will handle the disturbance. If you have, infinite time, you can do it in a sort of a sequence like that. If you're working on a project basis where you have limited resources or limited knowledge or limited access to seedlings, you're going to go about making your choices. The choices that you're asking about are going to be based on what do you have to hand at this moment, and what will you have to hand in 3 or 4 years. So, for example, if you're starting a restoration project and you want to plant, or you need to plant for certain reasons, you need to plant this year, you're going to take the species that you can get from nurseries. If you've got a lead in of 5 years, then you can go out, collect seeds, create your own native plant nurseries, and you can experiment. And I think all restoration is experimental. So again, which species to plant at which time, you can make your calls, and you can look at your reference ecosystem and say, okay, these species seem to be handling the sun, or these ones look like they're going to need a little bit more aftercare to get established, or they might need a bit of shade. And that will go into your practice as you develop the project. So your choice is based on your reference ecosystem. It's based on an understanding of your reference ecosystem. And yeah, it's what resources do you have at that particular moment in time, and how can you go about it, kind of using your understanding of where you're at.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask, like, so after in the initial planting, or after a couple of years of you planting, there is a chance that some of these hardy species would be able to take over the system better than the other species that are planted, and it is possible that the diversity index may drop. So how, do you still recommend that we interfere at that moment of time and still remediate the situation, or you leave it to the nature for it to grow in its own way?
I think that's the wonderful thing about being a restoration practitioner. I think you've got to be involved, and you've got to understand, because I mean, the answer to your question can be either way. It could be that now is the time not to interfere, or it could be now is the time to interfere, depending on a number of parameters. And again, which of the species that are becoming dominant, and which of the species that are disappearing. Maybe again, you need to go through a cycle to get some of the species involved. That's your experimentation. But if you've got certain species that are very strong and taking over, then yeah, maybe you want to interfere. So it's really up to you as a practitioner and your level of knowledge for your ecosystem.
So I see that it's like very highly intuitive to the system that you're working with. And so how do you actually standardize, like when you give the standards for all the diverse ecosystems that are present?
Well, I think again, it's about understanding the continuum. It's about understanding where the reference ecosystem is and where the project is at this moment, and what practices are being engaged with to get you towards your reference ecosystem. So if you're working for in a rainforest, or if you're working in a desert, or if you're working on a grassland, if you have a clarity of what your reference ecosystem, where you want to get to, then you know where you are on the continuum, and you can see the practices that are being engaged upon. Are they moving you towards that point? So it's not you're not comparing the different ecosystems, and you're not comparing where one project is compared to another one towards the reference ecosystem, because again, some ecosystems could be restored in 5 years, and some may take 500 years. So you're looking at what are the practices, and where are you on that continuum with that understanding.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mazut. Okay, so there's a last question, and then maybe we can wrap it up. It's around 5:30 already. Yeah. So I think I'll hand it over to Dr. Parvez. He had a question. So maybe Dr. Parvez, could you unmute yourself and ask the question directly, please?
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are, sir.
See, actually, I'm not sure whether network is working very well in our region or not. Well, I am personally working on plant invasions in Kashmir Himalayan region, and we have a very strong group, and we recently reported in Nature Journal that these alien species are expanding. Although we are doing very good in this area, but we hardly have any information regarding the degradation of habitats with respect to other parameters of degradation. So is there any opportunity in future wherein we can link with your group, where we will be first evaluating these ecosystems and then working for possible measures so far as their restoration is concerned? Actually, we don't know whether to what extent our habitats have got degraded, and then restoration obviously will follow. Will you please elaborate in that context?
So I think the experiences that you're having up there are probably, again, you sound like you're working forward in a sort of pioneering way. And to answer the question that you mentioned, I mean, it would be fantastic if we could, utilize your knowledge and information and the understandings that you have as in terms of setting up a hub. I mean, you know, a hub in the Himalayas. You know, this is one of the really interesting, again, back to this thing that the ERA has such a wide spectrum of knowledge. So I think, yes, I would love to learn more from you about what's happening up there, and then to see how that can be factored into sort of an Indian, you know, we have the ERA, we have a fantastic group of people doing amazing things. And I think this, in a sense, to try and wrap up, is that the Global Biodiversity Standard is just a practical way of people utilizing their extraordinary knowledge, which is specific to particular habitats around India. How can we use that knowledge and get it out there that it helps and encourages other people to work to the restoration of ecosystems and hence biodiversity. So I can't really comment directly on the work that you're doing because I don't know much about it, but I think that it's absolutely in the right direction, and I think that, you know, like something like the Global Biodiversity Standard can really bring people together in a very practical way and utilize skills, and hopefully it also eventually encourages other people to do it, and also provides an income stream if the standard gets accepted on that higher level.
Yes, thank you. Actually, we are interested in linking this expansion of these invasive species with climate change. As we know that Himalayan regions are relatively new so far as their origin is concerned, and we obviously see many kinds of changes happening when it comes to the climate change, and alien species being I can say very much plastic, and they do respond to this climate change. And obviously we in a way we have proved it that they are responding to it, and they are a kind of expanding in a certain way. They are reaching high altitude regions. So as our goal is to see the kind of impact they will be having on these ecosystems. First there is obviously scope for generating a kind of baseline data wherein we will be assessing every possible kind of ecosystem vis-a-vis the alien species. Then comes the second step, that is their impact on the local biodiversity. And then obviously we will be very much happy whether we don't know whether you will be able to cooperate with us or rather collaborate with us in a certain way that will help our ecosystems in future. Thank you very much. I think we can share the knowledge. Obviously, if we get in touch in some way, I don't know how to contact you. If you will share with me the personal email or the email of the organization, I will write to you what is in our minds and what we are doing and what we think of doing in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Parvez. And yes, I'll share Paul's email ID with you as well, and to anyone else who is interested in working on, you know, or in working on helping develop a hub, or if you're interested in trying to figure out the if you want to help contribute in the germination protocol or other aspects that Paul had mentioned during his talk. I'd really like to thank Paul for his patience for fielding all these questions and going in above and beyond the time of the seminar to really answer everything for everyone. So thank you so much for that. And I also want to thank all the participants who joined in as well, you know, for the entire conversation and for being such a great audience and listening and asking all these questions to us. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. That was very nice. I look forward to meeting and communicating with as many of you as possible. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.